Greetings and welcome to Mount Olympus. I am Hercules Invictus, and today on THEOSOPHIA Esoteric Studies, I'm proud to bring you Lynne Micelii of the ARENYC, which is Edgar Case's organization. Greetings, Lynne.
Thank you, Hercules. It's nice to be here.
Nice to
My
have
guest tonight is Dr. Frances McCarthy. She's a spiritualist medium and best-selling author and teacher. Her new book is based on her doctoral dissertation, in which she researched new ways of thinking about consciousness in contemporary ghost literature. It's entitled The Re-Enchanted Ghost and will be published by Routledge next year. So, Karen, congratulations on getting your on finishing your PhD and on the upcoming book, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn.
So a little more about Karen. She was born in Dublin, Ireland. As you listen to her, you'll be able to tell that. She is a spiritualist medium, an academic, author, and teacher. She's also a former political journalist and war correspondent. She trained at the Arthur Findlay College in England, a prestigious school of spiritualism and psychic sciences. She's an adjunct professor at New York University, focusing on speculative and spectral literature. Spectral, if you're trying to think through what that means, it means basically about having to do with ghosts and spirits and so forth. Mm-hmm. She has taught classes in mediumship for a variety of spiritual organizations, including the Spiritualist National Union International, the online school affiliated with the Arthur Findlay College, and the ARE of New York. So this is a return interview for Karen, since we did an interview back in April 23 about her book, Till Death Don't Us Part. Till Death Don't Us Part. And tonight, we're going to be talking with Karen about ghost stories, ancient and modern, and how contemporary ghost stories reflect our cultural shifts and evolution of consciousness. Mm-hmm. So thank you again, Karen, for being here today.
Oh, thanks. No, it's a pleasure to be here.
You started out as a skeptic of paranormal phenomena, and in your early life, you were a journalist writing about provable facts of current events. And you made a major change in your whole belief system in life, so that now you're a practicing medium and writing about ghost literature. So in our first interview, we talked about your book, Till Death Don't Us Part, and your history that led to that shift. Maybe you could very briefly share how that happened.
Yeah, so it wasn't that I was just a skeptic about the paranormal. I was sort of a skeptic about any forms of spirituality or religion, you know. So I grew up in Dublin. I went to school. I was educated by the nuns. By the time I was 17, I'd had it, and that was it. I had no interest at all, as you do. But as a child, I would always see spirits. I would have conversations with spirits in the hallway or in a room as a small child. And I would just scare the Jesus out of my mother, you know. She'd be like, who are you talking to? And so, but, you know, and I have many of these memories as a child, waking up and seeing sort of an odd figure at the end of the bed, sort of thing. But they've never, ever scared me or disturbed me. It just always felt sort of very, very natural. And I would just go back to sleep. But, you know, as I kind of got into my teens, you know, you sort of lose interest, you develop interests in fashion and boys and going out and whatever, all the sort of normal teenage things. And by the time I got to 17, I was leaving high school, I'd really had it. I mean, I'd had enough of Catholicism and Catholic school and everything else. And so I kind of just went along my merry way. And as you mentioned, I worked in television for a while. You know, I was a journalist. I was in Iraq. I covered American politics for the Irish Times. And so it was only when my partner, I was writing my first book actually, and I was down south, which is where I came in Virginia, which is where I came across the ARE for the first time in Virginia Beach. I was writing my first book, which was part of the it was a cultural outreach as part of the Northern Ireland peace process. So I was writing about sort of history, really as in the capacity as contributing to the Good Friday Agreement, which was what brought peace in Northern Ireland. When I got a phone call to say that my partner had died very suddenly in New York. And I was, this is the truth. I was actually staying in a friend's house who was a rock and roll lighting person, and I was staying in her attic which sounds very, very creepy. It was actually a converted attic, but I was nevertheless staying in her attic in this small little town in Virginia while I was doing this research and writing up some stuff when I got the call. And at that point, what started happening, I was on my own in this big house, and what started happening at that point was all sort of odd things like the lights turning on, the furniture moving, and electronics turning on, things touching me, all the rest of it. And that's what I wrote about and what we talked about in the last time we spoke here with Hercules. That's propelled then this sort of investigative approach to trying to figure out what is going on. And so I ended up happening upon a local Catholic priest of all people who sort of helped me, strangely enough, along the path. And this is where I came across the Edgar Cayce Center. And, you know, I was in Virginia at the time, which sort of turned out to be sort of like the Area 51 of the afterlife, because the ARE was there, there was the Norfolk Spiritualist Church there, you know, the Virginia School of Perceptual Studies is there, you know, there's the Monroe Institute is there. So it was just this area where there was all of this sort of energy there. And I had to sort of go, you know, as sort of a very rational and skeptical person, of course, my first thought was, if the lights are turning on, if furniture's moving, it's a short or it's an earthquake or something. But then things were touching me, waking me up, all sorts of mad things were happening. And, you know, you get to a point where you think, God, I must be out of my mind with grief. But it didn't feel like I was out of my mind with grief. You know, I knew I was grieving. But it sort of sent me off. I started really trying to look into it and research and understand what was going on, which is what I naturally, my go-to sort of place on anything. And it became very apparent, and I talked about this in the book, Till Death Don't Us Part, so I won't go on about it here for too long. Eventually, the penny dropped, and I understood that it was my partner still communicating with me since he died. And it sort of opened up then, it reopened all of the early childhood experiences I had. So then I started becoming aware of all sorts of people, you know, belong to people. And so the reason to sort of finish up and get back to your question was, I kind of felt that it was actually somebody at the ARE in New York kept saying to me, because they were seeing what was happening and they were seeing the, you know, the people, the way I was interacting with people, it actually encouraged me, because you really need to do something with this, because it's immensely helpful to an awful lot of people. I wasn't planning on doing anything with it, to be honest, you know. And so that's when I decided, you know, if I'm going to step into other people's grief, I better really know what I'm doing. And so I studied grief and bereavement counselling at the Institute of Counselling in Scotland. I went and I started doing some training really to really understand mediumship and what was going on beyond just sort of getting an impression and giving a message. I just really felt ethically that if I was going to step into people's grief and step into people's world in this way, that I really wanted to make sure I was knowledgeable and ethical about the work. And so that's what started off then on this path, which is where, of course, we met.
So that tragic event really took you on a whole different trajectory that you wouldn't have taken probably in this lifetime.
Definitely not, yeah. Mm.
A few years back, I recall that you were making a study of Irish ghost tales, and now you've written your dissertation about contemporary 21st century ghost literature. And I see in a course description for the course you'll be teaching at NYU that you're covering authors like Henry James, Edgar Allan Poe, Stephen King, Toni Morrison, that are 19th and 20th century. So it seems like you're pretty much, you know, that you're pretty much covering the whole range of ghost literature now.
Yeah, so my monograph that Routledge is publishing next year, which is based on my doctoral research, that's on contemporary American, 21st century American writers, because they've taken, for some reason, well, I won't go into it because I've written 300 pages on that, so we wouldn't have time to go into it, but there's been a sort of an interesting development in American ghost literature that has moved sort of the ghost from this figure of haunting, which is what the ghost has always been in the ghost stories. The ghost stories have always been about humans, and then there's a ghost that instigates and it sort of sets the action in motion. But the stories are always about the humans, and they're always set on the planet, right? What I found in contemporary American ghost stories was there's been this sort of movement where the entire action is now moved into liminal space. That's what I'm calling it. It's called liminal space. Basically, an afterlife is space beyond this physical space. But it's multi-tiered, which is what Swedenborg talked about, back in the 1700s. Multi-tiered afterlives. But the ghosts it's all about the ghosts. So the ghosts themselves are the figures. There's no living people. There's nobody haunting. The ghosts are the ones who are haunted by trauma, by confusion, by a sense of worthlessness, and all of these sort of values that have emerged in contemporary life. Loneliness, valuelessness. And they're confronting all of these issues as the main characters in these liminal spaces. Very, very different from sort of haunting a living character somewhere on the planet, So it's been a very interesting sort of shift in American culture and literature into sort of starting to explore. And it's interesting that it's only American, because it's not happening really to that extent in literature from other countries, because I looked at Irish, Latin American, British literature, and there's some really, really interesting work going on in terms of literary innovation. But these concepts of consciousness and trauma and recovery and progression through liminal space is really emerging in contemporary American literature, which is quite interesting. The sort of courses that I've designed for NYU are sort of more broad spectrum. Those authors are included in it, but it was sort of like, it's you can't really take them in isolation. So we sort of start off with the tradition in America that's kind of led to this. It was really as an Irish person, it's been fascinating for me to see how this has evolved in another culture from my own.
What are some of the 21st century stories you've been drawing on in your research?
Yeah, so I looked at the four novels that I focused on, the four writers I focused on the most. Are George Saunders, who wrote Lincoln in the Bardo, which is just a tour de force in spectral literature and in narrative experimentation. I also looked at Kevin Brockmeyer, who's looking at sort of eco-spectrality, the post-apocalypse, we've destroyed the planet, and he's done some really interesting work in that. And then I also looked at some Mitch Albom, because he's sort of written his ghost stories in this sort of fable type of way, which is very accessible, but actually surprisingly complicated as well. And then I also looked at Alice Sebold's novel, The Lovely Bones, which, they made a movie out of, but the novel really upends, we kind of hear of murders and ghosts and we think, oh, it's a murder mystery. But she really upends that, because she tells you who the murderer is on page 2. So now we have to go, what is this about? And it becomes this very interesting exploration of trauma and grief and recovery.
When I heard that that The Lovely Bones was one of the ones that you were working with, it surprised me at first, because I read that one, I don't even think of that as a ghost story. But of course, technically, she is a ghost, or she's a discarnate spirit. So, she's what people would call a ghost. But you don't think of that way when you're reading the story. You're right. She's the main character, even though she's
the ghost, and she's in a liminal space looking back, but she's not running around interacting. She's not sort of haunting, moving the furniture and the curtains and hiding behind the curtains. She's just observing from the gazebo. But it's the same for all of them. All of these characters are in liminal space, so they've completely relocated the landscape.
So you feel that the ghost stories are telling us, the way these ghost stories have changed and evolved is telling us something about how our culture has changed and evolved. What do you see happening there?
Well, the ghost story, all through its history, has always reflected the society from which it emerges, right? So if we look at Ebenezer Scrooge, for example, and we look at the Ghosts of Christmas, they are written in an industrial era in Britain. And so Scrooge is part of that new merchant class and that industrial class and the exploitation of workers. And so you can see that these ghosts emerge addressing that issue. So this always happens with the ghost. The ghost that's the role the ghost story is always assumed, is mirroring the society that it comes from. And so it sort of, and exactly begs the question, so what are these ghost stories talking about? And so, there's obviously a range, but a lot of this is about, coming from societies where coming through societies now where people are feeling very lost, like there's the failure of the American dream, which is what Mitch Albom was talking about in the 5 people, the 5 people you meet in heaven. So we've got this crisis of the failure to sort of meet a level of success. We've got the sort of the working class, the people who can't get ahead. We've got the people who live their whole lives feeling like, that they don't really have any value, and it's sort of, it's creeping into our society as a whole, that if you're not wealthy or powerful or a celebrity, too often people are considered, feeling like they have no value, that they're not contributing. The other thing is, the idea, especially with Brockmeyer, is his whole ghost story is set in a city which is liminal space, because everybody's arriving there because we've destroyed the planet, right? There's only one person left alive on the planet, and she dies at the end, and she goes. And so he's exploring the climate eco-catastrophe through the ghost story, which is really interesting because it's a very sophisticated way of looking at a very contemporary issue. And then if we look at, George Saunders, he's located, it's called Lincoln in the Bardo. It's centered around Lincoln at the time when the Civil War wasn't going well. But of course, in liminal space, there is no time. And so there's people from all ages that are sort of in the Bardo, right? All of them in their own way, dealing with abuse, dealing with trauma, dealing with slavery, dealing with, some of them are in poverty pits. And there's this whole society there, and an awful lot of dealing with clinging and hope and denial. And, so an awful lot of these issues that are still driving us in today, these ghosts are having to face and encounter as they go along. And of course, at Seabold, we're looking at gendered violence and gendered violence against women as well. And we're looking at that form of trauma too. So there's the idea of the ghost has always been a figure of trauma, but in these, it sort of takes on a whole new, very, very contemporary exploration of trauma and how people are being traumatized, abused, and overlooked in our contemporary society.
That's the story about the eco catastrophe, and all the people are on the other side except for one. It reminds me of a movie that came out when I was maybe an adolescent. You'll probably maybe remember On the Beach, which was about there had been a nuclear war, and the nuclear material was in the environment, in the atmosphere, but it had not reached Australia yet. And the story all takes place in Australia, where they know that it's coming, and that they're trying to find some reason for hope, but they can't find any reason for hope. It's a desperately bleak story, depressing story, and it seems like the story you're describing is the flip side of that. It's like it's actually, well, we're all meeting in heaven kind of thing, or we're all meeting on the other side. And
it's not even, you can't even really call it heaven, because there's no God. That's the other thing that all these novels have in common. They're non-theological. So there's no God in any of them. Nobody arrives and meets God. You just arrive in a new space and then carry out, and you live in whatever you're doing in this space, which has its own different rules and you're different ways of behaving. And then you move on to whatever the next space is. So all of them move on to, like Sebald called it, her first heaven was called small heaven. She moves on to wide heaven. Eddie in the 5 people starts in first heaven, ends up, moves on to second heaven. In Lincoln in the Bardo, they all arrive in the Bardo, and then these angels come and always try to convince them to leave, and they never want to leave because they're so caught up on their own identity and their own traumas. But the angels are trying to get them to leave through a phenomena to something else. So all of these characters are devoid of any kind of God, any kind of judgment. There's no judgment. It's all about the individual. The emphasis is all on the individual. And so there's another thing that these novels have in common, is that there is no religious connotations. There's no theology at all.
So that says something about how our culture has changed, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of studies on the rise of what they call the spiritual but not religious, which are people who identify as spiritual but not don't have any religious affiliation. And there's been a huge growth in this everywhere, but markedly in America. And I kind of researched, like, why is that happening in America? And I think that America is generally more religious than Europe, for example. But America has always had a very individualistic streak in religion. So it's not like the Queen is the head of the Anglican Church and the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church. In America, since the birth of the nation, there's been different churches with different leaders around. So there's a sort of individualistic and very much a self-reliant sort of streak to American religiosity. And I think that's probably why America has been fertile ground for what I call in my research a post-secular concept, which is this space where we've moved into a sort of belief system where people are increasingly leaving organized religions to start to explore a much more personal religion and a more personal relationship with God, with the divine, or that power, whatever the name is for it.
So it makes sense that we'd also be exploring our artists would also be exploring, well, if we've kind of put fundamentalist religion aside, what does the afterlife look like? What is it if it's not what we were taught about, sitting in front of the throne of God and so forth?
Yeah, becomes a very sort of democratic sort of afterlife, or without any particular leadership, where it's really up to salvation, if you want to call it that, which of course they don't call it salvation, that's very biblical, but progression, maybe I say, progression and healing is determined by the individual.
And so your dissertation and your book are titled The Reenchantment.
Reenchanted Ghost, yeah.
Yeah, The Reenchanted Ghost. What is that reenchantment? Where does that come in?
So reenchantment is a sort of a field of study now, an emerging field of study now, where we've gone through very briefly, we had a very sort of, up until the Enlightenment in the late 1700s, early 1800s, we were sort of, society by and large was very religious. Almost all societies had a belief in some kind of God. The Enlightenment came along in the late 17th, the turn of the 18th century, and sort of, that all became bosh, and it all became replaced with an emphasis on rationalism and scientism. So here we are now 2 centuries later or more, and recognizing that secular paradigm has failed, that it hasn't, that sort of level hasn't filled a void or a need within the human, the being of the human, to feel that they are part of something greater than themselves. And we've sort of run into this now where there's now a feeling of moving into an era that is more post-secular. So it's not a return to organized religion, but it's also a movement away from pure secularism into this idea that we can be spiritual, that we can have and seek out our own personal relationship with God or the divine, that we can curate our own beliefs for what doesn't resonate with us. And so enchantment is connected to that, because enchantment back in the times of the Romantics and the Transcendentalists was this feeling of just being enchanted, right? Enchanted by Wordsworth's daffodils, enchanted by nature, and the Transcendentalists, of course, being, coming from not far from here, upstate, right? And so we have these ideas of enchantment as this sort of beautiful thing, but having gone through secularism, we can no more go back to just the state of enchantment, which was considered by the secularists and at the time of the Enlightenment sort of delusional. Sort of felt like it was, you're just floating on a cloud or waves and hills. It's sort of a bit delusional. Reenchantment is now where we've come through all of that, and we've come through scientism, we've come through secularism, we've come to now to a place where we need to find something beyond the self, a telos beyond the self. But we can't just go out and just decide to be enchanted again with the daffodils and the whatever, because we've become too rational. We've been through the secularism, we're moving on to something else. So re-enchantment is this idea that we can be delighted and enchanted without being delusional. So we can understand that there is suffering, that there is pain, that there are these other darker and more negative sort of facets to life, but we can also find ways to be enchanted by it. So it's considered re-enchantment.
Interesting. And that's an area of study in itself.
It is, yeah.
Are you saying that? Yeah, interesting. I did not know that. So when well, let me just comment this a different way. It seems to me that part of what people got out of reading traditional ghost literature was this kind of delicious, spine-tingling scariness. Like when I was young, I just loved to be scared half out of my mind by horror stories, horror movies, scary rides in amusement parks. And there's a kind of fun scared that, people enjoy. Obviously, we're coming up on Halloween, and that's what Halloween is pretty much all about these days. What do people get out of the new spectral literature that's different from that? I mean, thinking of The Lovely Bones, it is scary at the beginning, but the rest of the story is not exactly that kind of spine-tingly scary.
No, they're not scary ghost stories
Yeah,
at all. But that's
yeah,
not, there's not trying to be scary ghost stories.
right. So
They're very sophisticated. They're very sophisticated ghost stories that I think really sort of ask us to really reflect and think. Reflect and think who we are, our part in the world, how we interact with other people. I mean, this is Eddie's whole issue in Five People is, did he actually, what he said, I lived a nothing life. Did he actually really live a nothing life? And what Album does in that is he meets different people he met in his life and who he affected, and he starts to see his contribution to life was far from nothing. And I think that these sorts of novels are not about trying to scare you silly. They're about really looking at the beauty and the tragedy, of life and what we hold on to and what we contribute, and just sort of ways of looking at the world and our part in it. Because they're in liminal space, for example, they can move through all of these what would be fantasy areas. You couldn't write this as realistic fiction set on the planet, obviously, because they're floating through different worlds and, whatever. And they have all, Lincoln and the Bardo, they've all got these like deformities that come because they're outward manifestations of their inner trauma. So these are only things that can really be explored in liminal space where the normal rules don't apply.
Right.
And so what it does is it makes it very, very apparent. They're really very, very sad and quite redemptive in a way, but that's what these novels are about. They're not about just having a good old scare, like Stephen King,
Right. Well, Stephen King sometimes had a little bit of social commentary in there, but
Oh, Stephen
mostly it
King is
was,
a phenomenal writer. I think he's an amazing writer, but he is a scary writer. I
yes,
mean,
yes,
yeah,
that's
very.
probably the main thing we think of when we think of Stephen King.
Yeah, no, he's exceptional. I love Stephen King's writing. He's a really, really fabulous writer, and immensely descriptive, which is why those scenes are so scary, But yeah, or The Haunting of Hill House, But a lot of this is also psychological terror. I mean, one of the most famous American stories ever is Henry James' Turn the Screw, and there's really no real evidence that there's ghosts in it, but it's a really scary ghost story about somebody who believes she's perceiving ghosts.
Right. And not very much really happens, but
No, but
it
it's the same
happens.
as The Haunting on Hill House as well. Nothing really happens.
It seems to me that you've become kind of a world expert in spectral literature. What would be the next step in that, if there is a next step for
I'm
you?
not sure. Yeah, I hope I'm an expert. Rutledge are publishing me next year as as an expert in this. So, but I'm not sure. Then we'll have to see. I'm still sort of getting this monograph ready to go to print. So hopefully when I get back in January, all that will be already handed back to the publisher, and I can start looking at something new. I have been doing some conferences. I did a couple of conferences this year. you're talking about these subjects as well, and I'm sort of thinking next year I may, work on some papers. I've got some ideas for papers for the Society of Cyclical Research, which is a very old society in Britain, and just some things like that. So it's just starting to explore, maybe sort of away from literature, starting to explore some of the more contemporary thought around this. See, I think what I like about this sort of approach is that it's taken serious research to actually produce something new, which, you know this as well, I've talked about this many times. I highly value education. I don't think experience in and of itself is enough, and knowledge in and of itself is enough. There has to be a balance between both of them. And I often feel that, in the world that we're in, of sort of mediumship and spirituality and channeling and all this sort of stuff, often knowledge gets overlooked. And the emphasis is put on the experiences. So I really do strive to try to bring, even when I'm teaching, I try to bring recommended reading and discussion into the classes, so that people have a better understanding of the context and the history and the tradition that they're working in, and some of the other great thinkers that have gone before them, and then also have these personal experiences themselves. So we'll see what happens with all of that next year.
That's a good approach. In your NYU course, which is going to be called The American Ghost Story, your students will be reading some of these wonderful books and stories. Will you have them do any writing?
No. Those classes are really just exploring the literature and the ideas and the concepts, very, very much discussions. I do some writing classes. I do, this year I did a writing class with the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Centre in Scotland, where we do sort of some memoir writing, some inspirational writing. I have a trance class coming up that starts in a couple of weeks. We do a lot of trance writing in that, so that's actually channeling writing. So we do a lot of experimentation around writing, but a literature course, really the focus is on the literature, and the creative writing courses are a very separate field.
But you are bringing the ideas from your mediumship experience into this teaching of writing, because if I recall correctly, in some of your classes, you use meditations and guided imagery to stimulate the creativity of your students before they write.
Yeah, I mean, I think all inspiration is coming from the spirit, no matter what you want to call it. And some people will call it something else, and I call it the spirit, because I find that, and I see this in class all the time, when we move people into that sort of altered state, the difference between what they write and what emerges from that to what they would write if I just said to them, okay, write me a 500-word essay on something or other, it's night and day. I mean, even the students themselves are astonished at what they produce when they write, when they move into the altered state and write from that space. So I think it goes for music and art and everything. I think all creativity arises from the altered space, the altered state of being very, very much attuned to the spirit incarnate. The spirit, of course, is no separation, the spirit of the energy and the consciousness of everything. And I think all of that is tapping into that stream once we kind of get beyond the meat and potatoes of our everyday sort of way of thinking and move into these altered states of being. But I mean, it's not just art. I think even sort of scientific breakthroughs. I mean, Schrodinger read the Upanishads. David Bohm worked with Krishnamurti. So even the scientists, when they are at an impasse, have gone to the great spiritual thinkers for inspiration. And so I think I even know myself, when I'm writing myself, I can get up in the morning and I can sort of move into that space and I can just write. And by lunchtime, I've written an entire scene and it's just flowed, and you just follow it, you just go with it. And then there's other mornings you wake up and you sit down and you can't get it one sentence out without sort of selecting all and deleting it 10 times, So there's a big difference between what comes when we move into a state of attunement and a state of flow, and what just comes in our normal waking mind.
Right. And some scientific breakthroughs came from dreams.
Yes.
Because the scientists had dreams. Well, also, if I recall correctly, one of your writing courses was aimed at helping people write about grief, write about and deal with grief and trauma. Is that right?
Yeah,
Was
we did that this year at the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre earlier, I think February and March. We did 8 weeks of sort of writing memoir, working on sort of memoir writing, to sort of work through grief. So that's pretty powerful. Those are pretty powerful classes as well, because we do that writing in the altered state as well, in a light altered state. So we are always working in the inspired state. We're not just sort of writing a load of prose and just ranting. You can do that in a journal on your own time. So what we're really doing in these classes is trying to find that spark of inspiration, because it's an awful lot of, it can kind of bring an awakening, and an awful lot of healing can come when we write from that space as well. So it's very experimental always, and it's very individual, but it can be very, very powerful writing about grief from the altered state or from the inspired state.
So, if we could move for a moment from your writing or from writing in general to your work as a medium, that's also about helping people move through grief and through the trauma of loss, isn't it? That's kind of where we started this conversation, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I just, with the caveat that I don't think mediumship is a replacement for grief therapy. I mean, you still have to grieve, but it certainly can be immensely reassuring. I mean, I don't know where I would be without it. My partner died. I lost a child after that. Both my parents died. I don't know that. I can't imagine how I would have made it through all of that without the continued relationships, and without the mediumship, and without knowing that life is much, much bigger and much more ineffable than we can even begin to understand. That mystery is just a phenomenal phenomena and there's so much also to look forward to. So for me, in my own life, I feel like I've been, in all of the loss, I feel like I've been blessed with the ability. But I think it's very, very helpful and validating for other people when they can come, and when you are sort of working with information you couldn't possibly have known, that helps them really understand that, oh, this really is my mother or father, husband or child, or whatever. But then, it's not just that. You're able to bring that sort of presence. So you're not just throwing out a bunch of random facts. You're actually able to, and that's where I think storytelling really is helpful in mediumship. I think all of these things are connected. Understanding character and understanding story generally means that you can understand character and the story of the person you're communicating with. And so it allows you to bring that person's presence to be felt and touch the loved one here. And I think that's what's really extraordinary about it. And I think when you are able to share with people their loved ones' observations about things, the new car they just bought, or the swimming pool they want to put in, or whatever it is, and these, or the whatever the curtains that haven't been drawn since the person, haven't been opened since the person died. Just these little observations that make people realize, oh my goodness, my loved one is still here. I can still talk to them. There's still, nobody's gone and nobody's left me, and I think, how marvelous is that, of all of the betrayals and divorces and everything in the world, your husband can die and not leave you, or your wife can die and not leave you. I mean, isn't that extraordinary? And so I think it's amazingly helpful to the grieving process. But we still do have to grieve, because the person's physical loss there's still the physical loss, so we still do have to grieve. So like I try to ask people not to, if they want to come for a sitting for mediumship, to only come once every 6 months, because I'd rather encourage them to learn how to recognize and work with their own loved one directly than foster a dependency on a medium, because
Exactly.
you've got to work through that grief. And you really, ultimately, it's better to sort of learn. I mean, I designed an entire course to teach people, called Love After Life, to teach people how to work with the sensitivity and the signs and of their own loved ones, so they can kind of still work and have the excitement of a new phase and a new stage of this relationship and this new language they get to share. I think that really is quite helpful for people as well, to know that it continues. You don't need to keep, this is not, I can't talk to my child or my husband only when I go see a medium. I can actually do that anytime, and I can learn the techniques and the altered states and whatnot to sort of help that happen. I think that's immensely helpful, certainly to people. I think anything when we're grieving, anything legitimate that restores hope is invaluable.
When you published your book, Till Death Don't Us Part, you got a lot of reactions from people afterwards, didn't you? From people who had had losses, and probably some of them might have been skeptics too, but your book touched a chord for them.
Yeah, I think quite a few people who I wasn't aware were open to, because I mean, I never had these conversations with people. I mean, I was doing politics and war, and these are just not conversations that ever came up or that I was ever interested in. But once my partner died and all of these things started happening, and then at the ARE I had some really interesting occurrences of somebody else's grandmother, and some, these sort of showing up in a Reiki share one night, with Peter Goldbeck, that I started noticing that when I started talking about this more, other people were more forthcoming about their own experiences, so people who would never have broached this or raised this subject ordinarily, all of a sudden felt very comfortable, started telling me all these stories that they'd never told anybody else in their lives, and I was quite surprised that some of the people were very open to it, and quite surprised at some of the people who absolutely weren't. Some of my closest friends at the time just weren't, and it causes this huge chessboard move of people moving off and new people moving in, because of your paradigm shifts so radically that you relate to a whole bunch of people over here you never related to before, and you can't relate to all the people over here that you related to all your life. It becomes a very very tumultuous, very, very tumultuous time, I have to be honest, but I think I really do think that we have to be prepared for that. When these things, people are very quick also. I'm always say to people, be mindful of who you share your experiences with, especially if you're grieving, and especially if you don't have the faculty to be aware of your person all day, every day. Other people are always very quick to write it off as like, oh, you think that your husband's turning on the light by the bedside, oh, it's your grief talking. And there's people who are very quick also. I mean, I encounter this myself, and I know people encounter this all the time. Other people are always very quick to rationalize away your extraordinary experiences, and I think that we need to be careful, or we need to protect that. We need to be careful of that, take care of ourselves, take care of that relationship, and be very discerning about who we share these experiences with, especially in the early days of grief. Because in the early days of grief, people, I mean, I remember when my partner died, my friend whose house I was staying with, she was poo-hooing everything that was happening, and I was like, you don't want to be going around saying something like that to somebody who's in the early stages of grief, whether you believe it or not, So a lot of, you really need to, I think it's very good to try to find a support group or a spiritual church or some center where there are people with shared belief systems as you, so that you can talk openly and ask questions about these things, and not have people sort of dismiss them as the grief-induced delusions, which often people do.
Even therapists often would see anything, any sort of religious ideation or spiritual ideation as being a symptom of some sort of disturbance. But that's changing now. That is, I think that has changed and is changing. So as society changes, and people talk about more of these things more openly. So you made some reference to this, but you've made a significant change in the way you do your your work as a medium, and it has to do with the stories that spirits of our loved ones have to tell us. Could
Mm.
you talk about that a little bit?
Do you mean in approaching mediumship like storytelling rather than,
Yes,
yeah?
exactly.
Yeah, so I'm a firm believer that if we really pay attention to how we think and how we talk to each other, we need to understand that that's the way our loved ones are trying to talk to us. So I wouldn't come up to you, Lynn, and go, blue car, subway, red house, black shoes, dog. That's not how we talk to each other. And too often, mediumship has become this list of facts. But a psychic can give you a list of facts by reading your aura without ever being connected to your loved one. But what a medium can do is actually make that presence felt. And you can make that presence felt from really being able to understand characters so that that sort of information naturally flows to you. When you have an innate understanding of another person's story, for example, then your mind naturally goes to story without even have to think about it. It just becomes a way of being. It's like the way an artist sees the light and will always notice light and color. When you're a writer, you always just think in terms of story. And so when I'm teaching, particularly advanced mediumship, I really try to teach people the skills of storytelling. And they're like, why are we learning this? And it's because we don't want to be in our mediumship going, oh, I've got a woman here with black hair and I feel like she had 4 children and she wore winkle pickers. That's not the way that woman wants to talk to her daughter. So we
Right.
need to
That's what
pay
they call
attention.
evidentiary. So they're giving these pieces of evidence because that will make the person believe that this is really his
Yeah,
or her loved
the
one.
psychic,
But
the psychic can do that. Yeah.
right.
But like, what is the mother? I mean, if your mother came along, do you think your mother would just come along and want to say to you, bread pudding, pink shoes, whatever? Do you really think that's the way your mother wants to talk to you? So I think we need to kind of get out of our way and understand that the person in the spirit world is a fully embodied character with this fascinating life story. And that's what they're trying to say, and everything that somebody shares with you, there is a story to it, So if your mother wanted to talk about bread and butter pudding, she's not just going to be talking about bread and butter pudding. She's not going to say bread and butter pudding. She's probably going to be talking about the day you made it, maybe that you made it in school. She's trying to evoke the memory of remember that day when we did this, So there's always a story to everything. So as a writer, my mind just naturally goes to the story, to the character, to what's going on there, to the little fact is the context in the greater story. So when you're open to receiving that greater story, then the greater presence and personality of the loved one can be felt. And only the medium can do that because they're actually blending with that person's personality, not reading this person's aura, And so I really tried to bring a lot of character and story into. It's always much more interesting. These people have lived and died. They've got a whole load of experience we don't have. Who wouldn't want to sit down and have a chat with them? So I think once we're naturally curious about people and their stories, that should exist then naturally in our mediumship as well. And I think being Irish kind of helps, because all we do is talk about. What we do is tell stories. We're always telling stories, even in the sort of, the way in America you'd say, hey, how's it going? In Ireland they say, hey, what's the story? It's just, it's the way it's said. So I think it was Bon Jovi in Ireland, or has just been in Ireland, and he said every pub he went into, everybody was telling stories, and he said half of them probably weren't true, but I still believed them all, Like everybody who comes, we come out of that culture of storytellers. And so it's just, it's a very sort of natural way of seeing the world for me. And so it becomes a very natural way of striving in mediumship to convey that more so. Because I've had lots of people I've sat with lots of mediums and had the 10 facts, check. I never felt the presence of anybody, Oh, the facts are all right, but I never felt any presence. But like I said, a psychic can give you facts without, by being, psychics connect to the spirit incarnate of the person living, and mediums connect to the spirit discarnate. And so a psychic can pick all of that up from you, but they can never pick up the sense of the presence in the story. And that's a real shift in mediumship. So that's where I really try to be with it.
And do you see a real difference in the reaction of your clients when you do mediumship that way?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, especially in private sessions where you have the time. If you're doing a church service, whatever, you've only got 7 or 8 minutes, so you're limited to what you can share in that. But you can still do little mini stories, and there's always going to be always going to be context. In a private sitting, for the most part, you've got 30 minutes, 45 minutes, much longer time to really get into the nuances and the complexities of the character and the relationship and their story, which is wonderful, because it makes it very interesting, exciting for me as well.
Yes. Do you find that's a teachable skill for your
Oh
students?
yeah, absolutely.
Even who aren't Irish and didn't grow up telling
Yeah,
stories?
because you can teach the basis of storytelling, and send people out to practice it all day, every day, and their neighbours and everywhere else, which I do all the time. Go out and capture that story, and here's the elements, and here's what to look at. Because if you do that naturally as you go through your day, it naturally becomes part of who you are, and then it naturally becomes part of your mediumship.
Yeah, speaking of your Irish background, I understand that through the Shift Network, you're teaching a course on the pre-Celtic gods. And that word that I have seen but I can't say. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so I'm teaching for the Shift Network over Patrick's Day. We're going to be doing this around Patrick's Day, 7 weeks on the Tuatha Danann, which is the ancient gods of Ireland that have arrived in Ireland in this mysterious mist, and they had all of these magical powers. And they actually, it's a very long story, we won't have time to go into it, but they are actually, with the arrival of Christianity and different invasions over time in the folklore, they retreated into the other world, into the fairy mounds. So they're called the Aes now, which is the people of the mounds, the she, which is where the banshee comes from, right? The banshee means the woman of the she. And so they still exist, so they say, in Ireland, But yeah, I'm going to be teaching, we're going to be looking at 6 or 7 different gods of that pre-Celtic pantheon, and what they mean, what they manifest, and working with the archetypes of who they are, and sort of embodying what they represent through different channeling practices.
And will that be in person or that's online?
Oh, it's online, yeah, all the Shift Network courses are online, yeah. Live online, but yeah, they record it as well.
So do you have anything else coming up that you'd like people to know about?
Well, I'd say if anybody's interested in writing, I've got, I think, 2 places left in my channeling class, which starts in a couple of weeks, and we do quite a lot of writing and speaking and from the inspired state. So say if anybody's interested in experimenting with their inspired or trance writing, to come along to that, or even their trance speaking, to come along to that. It's really experimental. It's always marvelous. I love teaching it because I'm always amazed at what people write. They're always amazed at what the wisdom and the inspiration, the beauty that people express in that state. Always surprises everybody, them most of all, So we've got so that's the next thing up, and then for anybody who is interested in learning the science and the sensitivity and the techniques to start to learn to communicate directly with their own loved ones, or have an awareness of their own loved ones' continued presence, I have an on-demand masterclass called Love After Life that was put together because everybody was asking me how to do it. And so I put together this 4-session course on, I think there's 20-something lessons in it, on different practices to help people to do that directly. I really love to see people be able to do that directly and have that experience, because that experience becomes much more profound, I think, than anything any medium can tell you, because you're having a direct experience yourself. So I love when people come back and have those, and they get all excited, and it's marvelous. I love it. So yeah, so Love Afterlife, that's on demand. You can do that anytime. And then next year we've got some interesting things. I'm talking to actually Kevin Tedeschi about doing something, which I won't talk about yet, but I think it promises to be very exciting. We're looking at doing something together in the spring.
Okay. Kevin Tedeschi, for our audience who don't know, was a former CEO of the National ARE. So, Karen, how can people reach you if they want to have a reading with you as a medium, or if they want to participate in some of your upcoming courses or workshops? How do they find out? How do they
Yeah, you
get the
can just,
details? How do they reach
I
you?
mean, I think pretty much everything is, you can find out on my website, which is KarenFrancisMcCarthy.com. It's Francis with an E, KarenFrancisMcCarthy.com. And then I always post everything. I actually have a whole free community on there as well. And we have little daily mini teachings that go out every day. So they can join the free community there, the Spirit Space community. Loads of free resources that are there to sort of help people who are interested in exploring more about this, so I recommend that as well. And then of course there's links to the social channels there, so they can find out what's going on daily.
So it's KarenFrancisMcCarthy.com, and
Yeah,
it's Francis with an E.
yeah.
And if anybody wants to reach me, they can reach me through the ARE of New York, Edgar Cayce Center. And the email there is info@edgarcaycenyc.org. And I'm going to spell that for you because a lot of people spell Casey wrong. It's info, INFO, at Edgar, EDGAR. Cayce is CAYCENYC.org. So we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much, Karen. This has been
Oh,
really
thank you.
interesting, and it was really nice to see you again.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for having me, and thank you, Hercules.
Thank you, Hercules.
And thanks to both of you. That was very instructional, thought-provoking, and entertaining. And I'm looking forward to your third visit on the show.
Me too.
Delighted.
Thank you both.
Okay, good night, everybody, and thank you for tuning in. Until next time, this is us wishing you joyous journeys and amazing adventures. Good night.
Good night.